This is episode 6 of When Nature Unearths the Dead. If you're new to the channel, or if you haven't seen any of my previous instalments, this is where I take a look at several cases of when the unforgiving forces of nature have abruptly pried the dead from their tombs. A great deal of rainfall in central Kansas in late March and early April of 1973 caused the banks of Walnut Creek at the city of Great Bend to flood. The Walnut Creek, which adjoins the Arkansas River to the south, then ran close by to a farm owned by one Wendelin Herman. On Sunday, April the 1st, Herman was at the riverside inspecting the high water on his land when he found, at the bank of the creek, exposed human bones, made visible by a massive eroding of the creek's bank caused by rushing high water. The Barton County Sheriff, Marion Wees, accompanied by Professors Sherman Nystrom and Jimmy Downing, went to the Herman residence, which was close to the former site of Fort Zara, a 19th century military fort. There they uncovered 3 human skeletons. The excavation wasn't concluded until the next day, when 7 more sets of remains were unearthed. A professor at the Barton County Junior College, after an initial examination of the artifacts found alongside the skeletons, was of the opinion that the people had lived within the last 50 years. However, when archaeologists from the Kansas State Historical Society arrived in Great Bend to do their own examination, namely Thomas Whitty, Thomas Barr and John Reynolds, it was concluded that the remains, now known to be 10 adult males, were from a more distant past. The 3 men found extensive trauma to the skeletons, which included steel arrow points embedded in bone. The team then examined 19th century archives, namely the Leavenworth Papers, which was a long-running historical study of military tactics and events, and also records from the 42nd Congress. Both sources featured reports which strongly supported the theory that the 10 dead men were likely victims of the 1864 Walnut Creek Massacre. About a mile east of where the bodies were found, the men suffered a fatal ambush by a group of Native Americans, members of the Kiowa tribe. In 1864, wagon masters J. E. Crow and John Hills from Nebraska set off from Omaha on June the 27th with a 30-wagon convoy. Under contract to freight for the US military, they had a cargo of food, clothing, bedding and tobacco. Their final port of call was Fort Union, New Mexico. When they reached Kansas, a military escort had accompanied them from Fort Leavenworth for over 100 miles to Council Grove, but then returned to Fort Leavenworth with assurances that the trail was safe because of recent treaties. According to J. E. Crow's written account, as they neared Fort Zara, which was a small military base to the east of what is now the city of Great Bend, he saw Native Americans on the horizon. He wrote, "I saw from 100 to 125 Indians approaching. Our trains then stretched out about half a mile. The Indians divided at the head of our trains and rode down on both sides of us. They stopped along the trains and commenced firing upon us with bows and arrows and guns. They killed 10 men and wounded 5 men in the 2 trains." The dead consisted of 8 white and 2 black males. The dead white men were also scalped, but the black men were not. The accounts from the massacre say that the soldiers from Fort Zara, which was only a mile from where the massacre occurred, were aware of the danger the convoy freighters faced. Upon the orders of one Captain Dunlap, they attempted to approach to help, but had to turn back when faced with a further 300 Kiowa tribesmen, who emerged from the woods at Walnut Creek. But the convoy by now was already completely debilitated, with few survivors. When the native tribesmen left, the survivors and soldiers from Fort Zara buried the white men in the communal grave, separate from the grave of the 2 black men. All men were buried with their heads to the west and feet to the east, which archaeologist Thomas Whitty stated was the Christian pattern. A survivor named Albert Gentry was surprisingly the only armed member of the convoy. With his smooth-bore firearm, he was responsible for the only Native American casualty. A 14-year-old boy named Robert McGee survived despite being pinned to the earth with arrows through his body, scalped and stabbed several times. He exhibited his sculpted cranium as a sideshow attraction way into his adult life. The full excavation of the site where the bodies were found on the Walnut Creek bank in 1973 was completed after 2 weeks. The skeletal remains, along with artifacts found, were then taken to the Barton Community College, where students were given the opportunity to piece together the remains of the Walnut Creek Massacre victims. Some of these were put on display at the Barton County Community College at the end of April of 1973. Not everyone believed it a worthwhile or respectable thing to do, however. Here is a letter dated May 1st, 1973, from an unhappy resident of Great Bend, Kansas. A full forensic analysis of the bones wasn't completed until 1976, when anthropologist Michael Finnegan published the only anthropological and archaeological record of the remains at the time. He concluded that the 10 dead men were between 15 and 45 years old. And indeed he also concluded that 8 of the men were of European descent and 2 were of African. It was October of 2007 when 59-year-old Linda Lee Perry Ballard's family reported her missing. Linda from Junction City, Eugene, Oregon, was last seen on September the 30th, according to the National Missing Persons Directory. The website says that Linda left her home to go shopping with a friend in Springfield, but never arrived at the friend's house. Linda's family suffered as the mystery of her disappearance endured for 8 long years. It wasn't until Monday, October the 26th, 2015, that the mystery began to unravel. A driver that day had alerted the Lane County Sheriff's Office about seeing a partially submerged vehicle in a pond located off the Rande Pepe Beltline near the Northwest Expressway in Eugene at 3 p.m. A dive team responded first, and they did find a car, but due to poor visibility were unable to see inside it. The following night, just before 7 p.m, the vehicle was pulled to the pond's north edge before being hauled out. A quick check of the registration confirmed that it belonged to Linda Lee Perry Ballard. When officers opened up the car, they found human remains. More remains were later found scattered at the bottom of the pond. It wasn't long before the Oregon medical examiner identified the remains as Linda's. Prior to having gone missing, Linda had undergone back surgery to fuse 2 of her vertebrae together. The serial number on the plate used to connect the vertebrae is what they used to identify her. The sheriff's office concluded that there was no sign of foul play and that Linda most likely died as a result of a crash into the pond. It had only been made possible to see Linda's car, a blue 1987 Honda Prelude, due to a recent severe drought which had caused the water level to drop to its lowest point in years. Linda's family found solace in the closure, but sadly, when a reporter spoke to people living in Linda's neighbourhood in 2015, no one knew who she was. So, all it took was a drought and the emergence of her car to put Linda to rest, but a mystery remained. The guardrails around the pond were not damaged, and there were no witnesses to the supposed accident, despite it occurring on a busy section of road. Oregon's Herald and News wrote, "Detectives believe Linda must have left the road heading west and crossed into the grassy media before vaulting over the on-ramp and clearing the guardrail that protected the pond. The car then pitch-poled into a fir tree. Once striking the tree, the vehicle spun counterclockwise, landing on the embankment, then continued into the pond, investigators have concluded. The damage to the car was consistent with that theory. It had pop-up headlights that were not damaged, but would have been had Linda hit anything head-on. The windows were shattered, which was consistent with hitting the tree with the top of the car. The roof of the car was caved in from the front to the back, further suggesting that the car struck the tree vertically. Investigators further theorized that if the car had simply travelled off the road at a normal speed, it would have lost speed on the grassy area, so Linda's foot would have had to have been firmly pressed on the accelerator pedal to launch the car. Although there was some rain that day, investigators say that it's probable that the grass was mostly brown and dry at the time of year, thus making it easier for the car to maintain or gain speed while travelling over it. Because only skeletal remains were found, it's unclear if Linda was alive when she entered the water. She may have suffered a medical episode such as a stroke or heart attack, or she may have fallen asleep at the wheel. There was also no evidence that another vehicle was involved. Detective David Silano also pointed out that there was nothing to suggest that Linda was suicidal. He said in reference to the way the car left the road, "No one would have foreseen that they could have pulled that off. There's no guarantee that it would have happened like this. No one would have thought, oh, I will just fly over and land in this pond. So there's nothing suspicious, and we don't think that she was trying to hurt herself." However, as time went on, more information came to light regarding Linda's personal life. The missing person report issued by Junction City Police was a particular source of interest. She was in ill health at the time she disappeared. Her husband, Gerald Ballard, commented that she had struggled to gain weight and had weighed as little as 80 pounds in the past. She was on medication for a number of health problems and had previously suffered with an addiction to heroin, on which she had overdosed multiple times, the report said. Linda's son, William Perry, said that this was his worst fear, that she had gone somewhere and overdosed. Linda was last seen on the morning of October 7th, 2007, by her husband Gerald. The thing that raised the most eyebrows at Junction City Police Station was the fact that Linda was not reported missing until November 4th, over a month later. And it wasn't her husband who had made the report, it was her son's fiancée, Keela Howard. When her husband was asked about his lack of concern for his wife, he said that she had left him before without warning, and despite not taking any of her belongings, he believed that she had done it again. However, it turned out that when Linda had left Gerald in the past, it had only been for 3 days, not a month. Gerald Ballard also told detectives that, on the day his wife went missing, he had given her his debit card for her shopping trip, and later learned that she had withdrawn $80 from the US bank in Junction City that day. Ballard cancelled the debit card a week later. It was found in the bottom of the pond, with Linda's remains. "23 miles southwest of the city of Sarajevo, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, lies Lake Jamblanica. When the area was hit by a massive drought in March of 2012, a previously submerged 70-year-old cemetery was revealed. The resting places were part of a village that stood here until the late 1950s. 66-year-old Ramiz Memidzan was born in the area. He was a young boy when the dam construction and creation of Lake Jamblanica began in the late 1950s. The site was covered with 30 metres of water, never to be seen again until the drought of 2012, the worst the Balkans had seen in 40 years. It revealed the tombstones of its graveyard and broken railway tracks. Apart from the sad spectacle of the forgotten resting places and public transport, the 2012 drought left countries that rely on hydropower struggling to maintain a steady electricity supply. Close to the lake are the dams of the Neretva River, which feed a system that normally produce an average of 2,000 megawatt-hours of electricity per year. But the drought that began in August of 2011 quickly shrunk output to just a quarter of that amount. It forced struggling nations to import more power at higher prices. While standing in his boathouse, surrounded by arid earth, Ramiz Memidzan told one of the few reporters who spoke to him, "I cannot recall when the lake has ever been so low. There are no fish left here. The 2012 drought wasn't the last. The lake saw another great drought in 2017, again revealing the old village and the tombstones. This is Burrow Island, a tidal island also known as Rat Island, which lies between the town of Gosport and the city of Portsmouth in Hampshire, England. It's situated in Portsmouth Harbour and forms the entrance to Gosport's Forton Lake. The site belongs to the British Ministry of Defence and is 960 metres, or just over half a mile, to the west of the Portsmouth Naval Base. The colloquial name Rat Island dates back to at least the Georgian era, when the island was used as a graveyard for prisoners who died whilst on board the great ships that sailed around the world to and from Portsmouth. Back then, according to record, the island sometimes swarmed with rats that were thought to be feeding on the corpses of the prisoners buried there. The Hampshire Telegraph, as part of a 1960 retrospective on Gosport's military role through the centuries, wrote, "The island, which was and is still contemptuously known as Rat Island, was a burial ground for convicts who died in prison hulks moored in Forton Creek and in the harbour, or who were shot as they struggled across the mudflats in a bid for freedom." For over 200 years, stories were shared about this burial site for prisoners who had perished on the numerous prison hulks that lined the west side of Portsmouth Harbour. Prison hulks were decommissioned or captured ships that were repurposed in the 18th and 19th centuries as floating prisons to hold prisoners of war and convicts. 20 or more hulks were said to be moored in the harbour between 1796 and 1814, housing an average of 7,000 prisoners at any time. Conditions on board these dilapidated hulks would have been awful, and their masts, rigging and rudders would have been removed, leaving the prisoners trapped in the fast-flowing harbour waters. Portsmouth's own Charles Dickens would have known of these great hulks in the harbour, and they may have been an inspiration for the character Abel Magwitch, the escaped convict from the classic book Great Expectations. In early 2014, the southern coast of England was hit with fierce storms, the worst that had been seen for some time. Most of the south coast was affected and damage was caused. Defensive walls crumbled, coastal roads were flooded, and there were cases of people being washed out to sea. And here, on Burrow Island, when a small cliff face was severely eroded, human bones were exposed. When members of the public found the skeletons and reported it, the discovery was investigated. The first archaeologists to investigate the exposed bones were accompanied by operatives from Operation Nightingale, which is a military initiative developed to use archaeology as a means of aiding the recovery of service personnel injured in recent conflict, particularly in Afghanistan. An initial dig took place immediately in 2014, in which the remains of several males were recovered. A more detailed excavation was planned that would remove the skeletons and to further understand the remains and the historical context of their burial site. A team of veterans from Operation Nightingale and Breaking Ground Heritage joined forces with archaeologists for an excavation that took place in May of 2017. Known as Exercise Magwitch, named after the aforementioned Dickens character, the dig brought a large team from around the UK to Burrow Island, including members of Operation Nightingale. The group worked during the low tide hours and carefully excavated the human remains. Before the excavation, the diggers undertook training at the Cranfield Forensic Institute on how to carefully handle bones and identify basic data, such as sex and appropriate age. The Rat Island or Burrow Island site was indeed a burial ground with no less than 35 males interred very close together and aged between their late teens and early 60s. Despite the island not being consecrated ground, the elm coffins were aligned east to west as they would have been in a Christian burial. An assessment of the teeth indicated that most were from southern Britain, although a couple had spent their early years in mainland Europe and were thought to be Frenchmen. A second investigation was made in June of 2021. During a week-long dig, the skeletal remains of 12 more people were found, but this time it wasn't just the remains of men. Among the long dead was a baby and a woman. So, contrary to common belief that Burrow Island was strictly a burial ground for male outlaws and prisoners of war, it had, at some point in the distant past, become the final resting place of a child and possibly its mother. One other thing of particular interest was that one of the male skeletons had a craniotomy, which is the surgical removal of part of the skull to expose the brain. This was usually undertaken in order to perform surgery, but it could have been done during a post-mortem examination, or maybe the body had been used as a medical training cadaver. One of the many skulls underwent treatment for a facial reconstruction. Richard Osgood, a senior archaeologist speaking to the Ministry of Defence magazine, said, "The results were striking. We are now able to look upon the face of a man who lived and died in the naval base some 200 years ago. Perhaps not the face of Abel Magwitch, and perhaps not someone who had committed any crime at all, but someone whose bones still can tell a story." The investigative work carried out at Burrow Island was permitted under a Ministry of Defence licence, which required the remains to be reinterred once the work had been completed, but this time in a place with no threat of erosion. To end, we have a short, and it has to be said, somewhat inconclusive story. This discovery took place in 1903, following the floods that affected large areas of Kansas that year. One of the worst affected areas was the capital, Topeka. On Friday, June the 26th, to the north of the city, in the corner of a plot of land owned by a man named J.B. Evans, 6 human skeletons were found in a hole when the earth was washed away by the floodwater. The hole was situated at the corner of an orchard, reports say. There is no mention as to whether or not authorities believe the occupier or past occupiers to be guilty of murder, or if the skeletons were believed to be those of indigenous people who had occupied the land previously, or something else, not even conjecture. The house was described as the old Evans place, suggesting that the family were well known and had been there for generations, but the report goes on to say that J.B. Evans had only been there since 1878, so maybe it was handed down to him. The discovery was reported across Kansas and neighbouring states, but in each case it was the same short write-up. There is no follow-up to the story as far as I can see. If anyone watching can shed some light on the story of the 6 skeletons found on J.B. Evans' Topeka property following the 1903 Kansas floods, maybe I can add some more information in a later episode.